thanks Mark for that introduction, and I won't go through the distinguished guests, but I hope over the next half an hour or so I can do justice to the introduction. So distinguished guests, colleagues, there's a number of colleagues here from independent schools and also from our office and the broader education community. So the challenge today is to try to give you a bit of a profile of what the independent sector looks like, because if you were to rely on the Sydney Morning Herald, you'd have a very different view of the sector. Anytime there's an issue about independent schools in New South Wales, they invariably take a photo of the gates at King's. And they're very lovely gates, of course, but I don't know if they necessarily represent the broader sector. So I'm going to start with the demographics and just give you a look at what the sector looks like at the moment. I promise this won't be death by slides, and I would invite people to comment as we go through if there are any particular issues you'd like to raise. Okay. So, AIS New South Wales is a little broader than New South Wales, as you can see. We have just over 400 member schools in New South Wales, and we also have a small number of large schools in the ACT. You'll also be interested to see that we have a number of what we call global schools. They typically are the Australian international schools throughout the Southeast Asia region. But with the encouragement of the New South Wales Government, we in fact will be looking to spread our influence, if you like, into the Middle East and certainly more into the Pacific area as well. They are typically schools that conduct the Australian curriculum, and we provide support to those schools. So it's, by any stretch of the imagination, it's quite a large number of schools. What does it look like? I just thought you might be interested in this. If we went back into the early 80s, you would see the faith-based schools be 100%. So our faith-based schools were in fact the basis on which the independent sector was established. And with this AIS, as we know, it was established in 1968, so we're not that old in that regard. Prior to that, of course, many of these schools existed, but they didn't come together, if you like, under the banner of an association of independent schools. Remember, we're a member organisation. We don't own schools, unlike the Catholic sector and the government sector. So it's quite different to those two sectors. So you can see there, roughly 70-30 split in terms of the number of schools, and typically they're our faith-based schools. The biggest group being the Anglicans and the Catholic independent schools, by far the biggest group. Biggest growth area is the Islamic schools. There's 23 Islamic schools in New South Wales. 22 of those are in Sydney, and very rapidly growing. Typically, the non-faith-based schools fall into those categories, and typically those schools on the left-hand side tend to be smaller schools. That's the way they have operated. The Stein and Montessori schools tend to be community-based schools and tend to be smaller, and the schools on the right-hand side tend to be larger. So it comes as no surprise then that the full-time equivalent, what that means is the number of students, you can see has dropped from the number of schools, being 31% of schools, down to 13% of the total population. Because typically here, these schools being larger represent 87% of the students in these schools. So did you know that of those schools, that 41 special schools are independent schools? Most people don't know that. Again, the profile of independent schools is often portrayed as wealthy parents living in affluent areas, high fee. That's typically how it is portrayed. Those 41 schools look after children with disabilities and also children who are put into schools which are called special assistance schools. Oftentimes those schools look after children who have been, to put it bluntly, expelled from other schools, and this is their last chance. And they do a fabulous job, in my opinion. There are 53 boarding schools. There are a total of 56 boarding schools in New South Wales, and 53 of those are independent schools. So there's 3 government schools that are boarding schools. And of course, they have a particular role in New South Wales, in as much that historically they have looked after children from far-flung areas of the state and the country, and these days also look after international students as well. You might be interested to know that every one of those 53 schools offers Indigenous scholarships. And again, not well known, but that is the case as well, but I'll talk more about Indigenous in a second. If that doesn't surprise you, I've got nothing much more to surprise you with. But so close to half of our schools are 200 students or fewer. And also nearly 2/3 of our schools have an SES, a socio-economic status, of 104 or less. 104 is considered to be the median. I'm not going to go into how the system works. Suffice to say that schools are represented from having an SES at the lowest end of 85 through to the highest end of 130. And if you lined all the schools up in New South Wales in order, the middle school, the median school, will be 104. And again, I think most people would be very surprised to see that 2/3, or just about 2/3 of the schools would fall in the lower end of the SES range. And these are the most current figures we can have of students with disability in our schools, and also Indigenous students. So that's a quick profile, albeit a rather macro profile of the sector. But I thought you'd be interested in that in terms of how we are profiled. I just want now to show you numbers, not so much the past, although I'll show you that initially, but as we project into the future. We were just having a discussion with a few people before we met in here, and these numbers are quite stunning. So in 2001, these are the total student population in New South Wales. Obviously, it's not just independent schools. 1.1 million. It went up by 87,000 to 1.2 million in that 15-year period. So that's the growth of students. Over the next 15 years, that's the growth. Wow. They're not our numbers, that's from the Department of Planning in New South Wales. So we will be experiencing enormous growth in the next 15 years. If you listen to this morning's news, there were demographers saying that New South Wales population growth, in fact, was going backwards and was reliant totally on migration. I'm not too sure where they got their numbers from, but certainly the numbers we've got from New South Wales Planning demonstrate very significant growth. What are the implications for New South Wales with that growth there? We all know about traffic problems. We all know about the cost of housing. I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about education. There will be massive implications for schools in New South Wales, and in particular, already, I think I've got this wrong, my voice, you don't need the mic. Already we know that schools are under enormous stress in terms of being able to enrol current students. Depending on the area in which you come from in Sydney, you would notice that could in fact be an issue that you're confronting at the moment. I know in my area, I come from the Northern Beaches, government schools are full. Government primary schools in particular are full. You can't get your children in. So if you go to Manly Village Primary School, excellent school, has an excellent reputation. You can't get your children in. So what are we going to do about that? The government's not in a position to build a new school in Manly proper. They're building one at Manly Vale, but there's not that opportunity. Go for your little drive up the Pacific highways through the leafy Pymble and Turramurra and whatnot, and where those streets were defined by single residences. Thanks, Reset. That's vodka, I take it. Where they were defined by leafy residences, you'll now see 4 and 5 story unit blocks where the children go to school, because there's no new schools there. So you can see the pressure that is going to be mounted. And so the only solution to that Sydney problem is going to be current schools taking more children. In the Greenbelt areas, that's a different thing altogether, and building will take place. So anyway, with a view to those numbers, let's see what that might mean for independent schools. Now, sorry, as Mark said, I'm a former maths teacher, so I love numbers, but I'll walk you through this fairly quickly, because I think this tells the story. 3 sectors on the left-hand side there. You can see the growth that has occurred in the last 15 years. That's all I'm trying to do there is demonstrate that. So the growth in government enrolments was 3.4%, and whilst the percentage looks small, that's on a big base. There's a lot of children there. And similar, 10.4% for the Catholics, and we've had 26.9% growth in the independent sector in that last 15 years. We're not suggesting that those growth patterns of the last 15 years will be replicated in the next 15. But if you look to the next set of figures there, you'll see what New South Wales Department of Planning are projecting. And you can see there enormous growth. So for our sector, the bottom line there, we're talking about potential growth of nearly 75,000 students. We currently have about 195,000 students in the sector in New South Wales now. That is enormous growth. Where are we going to put them? Most of the Sydney schools at the moment have been unable to accommodate that growth, mainly because of the previous set. The government, as you know, has gazetted a new education set only last month, and that should allow for some of that growth to be accommodated. The government is saying that 75% of that growth there, so I'm going to use some rough mathematics for you, but around about 60,000, just for round figures, will be accommodated in existing schools. And so we need to therefore find schooling there for new schools for the remaining 15,000. And typically, in New South Wales, the independent sector, the average size is around about 500 students. So we need 30 new schools in the next 15 years. That's 2 schools per year. That's a big ask. Remember that 95% of capital is provided by parents in independent schools. So the parents are going to do that. At the moment, 2.1 billion, right? Billion is being supported by parents in terms of the debt in capital in New South Wales independent schools. It's a lot of money, isn't it? 2.1 billion. So are they impressive? Yeah, I suppose so, but it's an absolute challenge as to what we're going to do to be able to accommodate these children. Now, of course, if we don't accommodate the children in the independent sector, and similarly if the Catholics don't accommodate the growth there, where do those children go? To the government schools, right? And that's an issue for New South Wales government as well. Because instead of, as I just said, independent school parents paying 95% of the capital, it means the New South Wales taxpayer will be paying 100% of the capital. It also means that the recurrent expenditure, right? The year-on-year expenditure to educate the children will fall on the New South Wales tax payer, whereas if they go to the non-government sector, it falls on the federal government. So no one will admit this, but if you listen very carefully, at Macquarie Street, every time a student leaves the government sector to go to the non-government sector, there's a quiet clap, because that means the money's being transferred from the state to the federal government. So it is an issue that the state needs to consider. Okay, well, we haven't. Just very quickly, graphical is just showing you the growth patterns, so I'll just get them out of the way. New South Wales, let's have a look, where's this growth? Basically, the blue indicates pretty static growth. The reds and oranges, the brighter the colour becomes, the greater the growth is. So that's New South Wales as a whole, obviously. Let me drill down and show you exactly where the growth is. So you go and look at all the red patches there, and you can see where the majority of the growth is. I'm going to drill in a little bit further to Sydney now. And hopefully this works, yeah. So you can see the southwest, no surprise to people, the north as well, and notice the city area. Green Square is being developed to accommodate an extra 32,000 people in Green Square. There's no school. There's no new school. And the mindset was that Green Square is going to accommodate young business couples that will be childless. I'm not sure for how long, but there are massive, there are massive issues in terms of how children are going to be accommodated in schools. But it's obviously going to have to travel extensive distances. The bottom line there is the SES. As I said, it goes from 85 to 130, and I just thought I'd show you the profile there of independent schools in New South Wales. As I said, if the Sydney Morning Herald were writing a story about us, that would be the independent sector. It's 25,000 students out of 195 in New South Wales. Now, don't get me wrong, we're very proud of the role that these schools have played, but it would be wrong to suggest that those high SES schools are the only schools in New South Wales. They do a fabulous job, and I think many of you would be surprised at the role that these schools play in assisting the broader community. I can't mention the school's name because I don't have the permission to do so, and I'd get into trouble if I did. But there's a school that's well represented by people within their broader church here today, and you'll recognise the school, who provides their very extensive facilities to local government schools. And in a newsletter at the end of last year, the principal communicated to the community that their facilities were being used by local government schools. And that was acknowledged, and people thought that was a great idea. However, the principal of the local government school contacted the principal of the independent school and said, please don't put that in the newsletter anymore. Because the Teachers Federation became aware of that and blocked the school from using the school's facilities. That's a terrible thing to occur, but I want you to know that many independent schools provide their facilities to government schools. I won't mention the school's name again, but the one with the beautiful gates provides their facilities for the local government schools to run their swimming carnivals and athletics carnivals, and you don't hear about that. So I'm just saying that they perform a wonderful community responsibility for the broader community. All of the growth in the independent sector, that's a slight overstatement, it's not all, but the vast majority of the growth is here, as you can see. That they typically are the sort of schools that are represented here today. Certainly Amity would fall into that category there as well. And they typically, if you follow through the southwest and west of Sydney, they would be the schools that you would recognise. The other big growth group are the Anglican Schools Commission, and there's the Sydney Anglican Schools Commission, who now have 22 schools within their group, and they are typically very large schools of 1,600 students in that west and southwest area of Sydney. We did a survey of schools a few months ago. There's a few principals in the room here who would have filled this survey in, and just thought you'd be interested to see where this growth is going to occur. So schools with an SES of 94 or less, so typically anyone with an SES of 94 or less are very poor communities. And you can see there reflecting a growth of 21,000 students. The next group is that growth group that I mentioned, pretty much the same sort of number. Add the two figures together over here, and you can see that 70% of the growth is going to occur in the low SES area. Again, that's where the population growth is. You would typically expect that. And not as much in the others. In fact, you can see here in the higher SES groups, relatively small numbers, and that's due largely to the fact that all of those schools, they're full and don't have capacity to take additional children. And not only capacity, but there would be some of those schools who would say it's not in their best interest to grow any more than they currently are. So if we were to pick, I just randomly pick one of John's schools, Pymble Ladies College, 2,200 kids roughly, girls. 2,000, or Nancy as well, you know this number, 2,200 students. The odds of them growing much are pretty slim, not because they don't want to grow, but the argument could possibly be we're as big as we need to be. We get any bigger, it might get to the stage where we don't know the children as well, etc., etc. There's lots of different arguments. So it's not just a matter of capacity, it's also a matter of desire to grow. Hopefully my maths is correct. I notice there's a slight change there, but anyway, I'll blame Jackie for it. But roughly 75,000 students. As I said on the next maths session, I can't help myself if my numbers don't add up.
All right.
Let's numbers now. Just talk a little bit about pedagogy, because if we look at those numbers, you might say, why are parents choosing to send their children in increasing numbers to non-government schools? Why are they willing to pay their after-tax dollars to send their children to independent schools when they could send them to government schools at no charge? It's a very complex answer to that, but I'm going to suggest to you there are a few reasons for that, and here are some. I suggest to you that it's not just for academic purposes, or not just for the connections that are made at their school, but independent schools, I think, do an excellent job when it comes to student wellbeing. The research on this is very clear, and Mark's nodding his head, so I hope he's done some research in this area, can back me up on this. But when it comes to students being successful in schools, all of it shows that if we are looking after the education of the whole child, that is more likely that they will have a successful experience in schools. It's not definitive, but it is more likely. It's the probability is much higher. So all of those things. you would, those of you who are parents would know that if your children are in a happier state of mind, it's more likely that they're going to be successful when it comes to their academic engagement and results. It's more likely that they're going to remain at home or at school if they're happy where they are, their environment, etc. Right? That's what all that is pointing to. And I think most schools, and I don't mean just independent schools, most schools make a point of trying to ensure that their student well-being is of the highest priority. Similarly, this social and emotional learning, again, all of these, I'm not here to lecture at you, but these are the reasons that parents send their children to your schools. All of those things. If I asked you the question, as parents, how do you assess when your child comes home from school, or at the end of the year when you receive the report card or whatever, how do you assess value in terms of your child's performance? It's a hard question, because schools are a lot more than NAPLAN results. They're a lot more than HSC results. And the one thing that stuck in my mind was, when I put four kids through independent schools, and I was on this about a year or so back, because I made the mistake of saying, well, this summer I paid for, I've got to be careful, my wife's here, I don't know if I've told her this, but I paid for the grandkids' education. Thank you. Unfortunately, since then we've had more grandchildren. I've got 8, and I'm a bit worried that I've made that promise. But for me, when you make an assessment, you make an assessment, are your kids happy? That's a pretty important one. And if they're happy, it's likely that all of these things will fall into place. As I said to you, there's a lot more to school than an academic testimony. So I think it's really important that we keep that in mind when we're assessing the value of school education. It's not just an academic result. A lot of text there, but in terms of Indigenous education, I mean, I love the little caption there, and I thank Roz from our office who lent me that. I actually pinched it, but I did tell her after I took it that it was great. And that's what we're about here. It's that whole notion of what is equality, what is equity, and it's equity is what we're looking for, isn't it? In terms of our Indigenous students. Closing the gap has been on our agenda for such a long time, and I think we are making inroads there. But this is a long journey. Let me go back to the 53 boarding schools that offer Indigenous scholarships. We've learned a lot over the years as to how we can be more successful with Indigenous communities. And typically now, most schools have an unwritten policy that they try to bring children from the same Indigenous community into their school. That provides a level of support that they wouldn't otherwise have. And those schools that have done that have found that the children's performance has far outstripped the performance of when children just came in, if you like, in a random pattern. So we did a lot of research in this area, and we're supporting a current research program with Rob, 4 schools, and they are a couple of city schools and a couple of regional schools who have large Indigenous populations. So we'll be very, very interested to see how that pans out. And it is everyone's business, isn't it? Before just about every meeting we have within the state in education, We acknowledge the traditional owners of our land, and it's not enough to simply mouth those words. We have to enact those words, and so it is everyone's business, and it is embarrassing at times when you consider the plight of Indigenous Australians, and we need to ensure that we do our bit within the independent sector to assist the Indigenous community. As Mark said in his introduction, I sit on a number of national committees for the independent sector, and I hear their requests for additional funding because of their attempts to assist the Indigenous community. The first point there demonstrates that New South Wales has the largest number of Indigenous students. And yet you'd think we didn't have any compared to when you hear our colleagues from other states and territories seeking to gain additional funding. Now, admittedly, we don't have the, if you like, the far-flung Indigenous communities of WA or Northern Territory for that matter as well. And there are particular issues in trying to assist groups in rather remote areas. But again, it's a large community here in New South Wales. But typically, you'd see cohorts there in that 10 to 20 range in most schools. We have, I was doing a quick count this morning, I think we've got 6 standalone Indigenous schools, independent schools in New South Wales. What has happened here in Sydney is some of our larger schools, they were the group I pointed out at the beginning, the high SES schools have opened Indigenous campuses, some in Sydney. Barker just recently opened one on the Central Coast, and they are supporting those communities in that way. So it's a little different, if you like, to having small cohorts of 10 to 20 students in your school. They've actually started up separate campuses. And the last point is a very valid point, and that is there are still a large number of students who will not identify as Indigenous students. And so therefore those numbers are likely to be a lot higher than are quoted at the moment. The table there on the left just demonstrates the growth that has occurred, and you can see from the previous slide I had 26.9% growth of enrolments over that period of time. You can see there over a shorter period of time we've had 42% growth in Indigenous students in independent schools. That's quite significant. And here you can see the regions from which those children are represented. So it's not just Sydney, although if you were to add up all the metropolitans there, it would be by far the single largest group. So just some data, just repeating what has been on previous slides, just putting it all together. The innovative programs I've mentioned and the research we're doing and the funding that we've done, we've partnered with Warren Lundeen, and he's been a great asset to us in giving us advice. He asked me to make sure that I plugged his new book that's coming out too, so I think that's next month, which will be an interesting read. And I mentioned the Barker campus, for example. Lots of good things happening. That's fantastic that retention rates are improving remarkably. Now, I've got to be honest, I mean, that's retention rates of the kids that are in our independent sector, remembering that there's a good number of those children that scholarship, if you like, for that. Now, be really careful there. When people hear scholarship, they assume that it's based on a particular trait of the student. No, that's not the case anymore. Joeys are not out there searching for another Kirtley Beale. Just thought I'd mention that now. Up the Wallabies won on the weekend. It's a rare occurrence. No, that's the whole point of the scholarship is to bring groups from the one community into these schools. And in fact, again, I won't mention the school's name, but it's not very far from Joey's. They offer 40 Indigenous scholarships per annum. It's quite significant. The old boys have got a foundation together, and that's how that is funded. The other thing, a lot of words there, so don't worry about reading that so much. The independent sector is also based on a number of traditional ethnic groups, and as a lot of things within this country are based upon. If you looked at our current A-League, which has risen to great heights, you'd go back and you would see virtually every one of those A-League clubs was based on an ethnically based group who formed a soccer club. We call it, not allowed to call it soccer anymore, football. And so not surprising that is the case now. And I'll show you a few case studies at the end, and you'll be stunned at the breadth of ethnicity within those schools. So languages is really important, and we have an extraordinarily high percentage of children within the independent sector who study a second or third, and in some cases a fourth language. So that's fantastic. PISA. I've left this to last because I said to you from the outset that we had to make sure that we don't focus all of our attention on academic results. But I found this data, my colleague at the back here provided this PISA data for me. Just, if you can't read that, the blue indicates that both parents were migrants, the children. The dark blue or black in the middle, that one parent was born overseas. And the green means that both parents were born in Australia. Now, if that doesn't tell you something, I'm blind Freddy. Why is that? That's rhetorical. So that's right. That is all schools under PISA. So you can see that kids who have both parents born overseas outperform all other students. In the independent sector, now look at the scores too. So the highest score there is 513. So this is independent schools. Exactly the same pattern, isn't it? Again, students with both parents born overseas outperform all others. It's a good argument, isn't it, for our diversity of ethnicity within this country. And people who would argue otherwise, are a little blind to some facts. I've got my own theory on it, having been, a principal for a number of years, and I think there's a bit of a malaise, if you like, with families who might have had it a little easy. But I suspect that these families where both parents are born overseas, they've had to work very, very hard to in fact educate their children, and I think their children probably respond accordingly. Just about there. So school enrolments the last 15 years have increased by 18%. Total school funding has gone up 100%. And yet our performance is Year 9, PISA. We dropped to 21st place in the world. I want to thank Ahmed. Thank you for sending me your kindergarten photo. No, that's really Ahmed there, isn't it? It looks like you've been in a good paddock there too, Ahmed. Have a look at that bottom there. When we take the results of New South Wales independent schools separately from those of the state, we've jumped from 21st in the state to 21st in the world of those countries undertaking PISA to 6th. I think that says something. When one of my colleagues, Chris Duncan, and I do a bit of governance work on weekends, and we provided that paper to a board, they grabbed it and said, oh, this is gold. We can use this to demonstrate to parents that all their money they're spending on school fees are actually working. So, yeah. So there's the key points on the academic performance. And again, I think I've covered all of those there. I just want to finish with 3 case studies, and I appreciate the 3 schools that allowed me to do this. I rang with each of them to make sure that they were happy for us to put this up. So here's Amity. For those of you, I mean, there's a big Amity group here today, but for those of you who, I've only used the Preston's campus for this particular example. So Preston's is Liverpool Way, relatively low SES, as you can see, an SES of 96. Probably without embarrassing the Amity people here, one of the real success stories, grown enormously, a great campus. The biggest eye-opener for me was a number of years ago, and it was when Ahmed invited me out to the maths competition that they run out there. I've never seen anything like it. There were kids from every sector, hundreds of kids in this maths competition that they run. It was like for those of you of my vintage, It's Academic of Mathematics. It was fantastic. And I remember so well, it was Neutral Bay Public on this occasion who won the competition. And to keep the crowds quiet, because it was an elimination thing, and so you ended up with hundreds of kids in the audience who'd been eliminated, so to speak, from the competition, and then the 2 schools up there answering questions. And so in between rounds, the MC was giving prizes to the crowd. And he pulls out everyone must have got a lucky door number type thing, pulls out a number, and the boy from Neutral Bay Public who'd won the competition won a prize. No prompting. Remember, these kids are in year 5 or 6. No prompting. He just got up and said, I think it would be totally inappropriate for me to take, this is what he said, totally inappropriate for me to take this prize. I just won a prize for winning the competition. Oh, wow. Is that an indictment of the education system? The first thing I did when I got back to the office was send off a letter to the principal of Neutral Bay Public. Great credit to the school, but an even bigger credit to the parents and to himself. I mean, that's wonderful. You always hear the lousy stories about education. I thought I'd throw the good ones in. So it's a non-denominational school. It's above the state average in NAPLAN, and I just chose year 3 and year 7, so I just chose a primary group and a secondary group to be consistent with each of the schools. The thing I wanted to point out is this. There's 46 nationalities represented in that school. Is that right? Reset, there's 48 now. Well, another 2 nationalities since I spoke to you a week ago. And there's basically no vacancies. The place is full. Just shows the Scott School at Bathurst, which has just purchased All Saints. I mean, that's anyone who knows church politics, for the Presbyterians to buy up the Anglicans. Wow. Although I don't think they've actually signed the deed yet. But have a look at Scott's a small regional school. This sort of fits into the typical regional school for independence. 277 children. That's pretty much on the cusp of being viable for a school that goes from kindergarten to year 12. In fact, they go pre-kindergarten to year 12, so relatively small classes. SES of 101, so not dissimilar to Amity, and you can see there that they're above in all of. I'm not being selective here. I'm just chose them at random. And it sort of surprised me to see that there were 17 nationalities represented there in Bathurst. There are vacancies in Bathurst, and it's more a reflection on Bathurst. I think it's just the nature of. And then to the other end of the spectrum, in New South Wales, other than Sydney, the only real growth areas, there's only really three. Albury is one of them. If you've been to Albury recently, you'll see there's lots of development happening there. The other areas in the Hunter, more in that sort of Maitland-Cessnock area, and the third area is the far north coast. Other than those areas, there's not a lot of growth, just a little bit maybe. Trinity is another example of a school that's only been operating for, I think, less than 10 years and has grown enormously. It is so popular, in fact, that students cross the border from Wodonga into Albury for their education. And again, you can see the profile there, and 23 nationalities, and they've got full enrolment from kindergarten to 8, and that's pretty much reflects how schools develop, because in the first few years, those children in years 9 to 12, they would have been smaller cohorts coming through in that year, but they're now at full capacity in the junior years. So, ladies and gentlemen, that I'm finished. You'll be pleased to know. That's the profile of the independent sector, and I hope it's helped to demystify some of the myths about the sector and given people more of an insight into what is taking place in independent schools in New South Wales. I think my observations over the 18 years I've been at AIS is that the schools are doing an excellent job in trying to support the parents who are the prime educators of their children. And we often forget that it is the parent who is the prime educator. I get a bit frustrated at times that schools are seen to be the panacea of all social ills. And in my time, I've seen schools responsible, well, there's a problem with sex education. Well, the schools will do that. There's a problem with drug education. Well, the schools will do that. There's a problem with driver education. Well, the schools will do that. Now we've got schools responsible for the radicalisation. I say, what on earth are parents doing? These are parental responsibilities. And there's been too much of this abdication and thrown to schools, so that now there's this view that the schools are going to sort of be the panacea of all social ills, and that's not possible. On that note, I better stop. Thank you very much.